Good morning, all. It is great to be back in the pulpit here at Creekside. It was a gift to me to know that you were in such good hands last week with Tim. If you remember, he talked about living and acting in such a way that other people will feel like they had seen Jesus Christ. And that is about as good a definition as I know of Christian formation and spiritual growth. Tim reminded us that who we follow makes all the difference where we're going to end up. If you remember, and I know some of you have been gone for the last couple weeks, this is the third Sunday of Lent, and our theme for Lent is growing in grace. Our image for growing in grace is that of a tree. Not this tree specifically, but any tree that has put down strong roots. And sturdy roots mean a strong trunk, a trunk that can support the weight of branches and leaves and new growth. But before I talk about trees, some of you know that Tim and I were on vacation in California last week. Some of you have been kind enough to ask how that time was, and the answer is spectacular. I shared here on March 1st some pictures of a desert before there has been rain and after there had been rain. It has been a rainy spring in Southern California, and I was hoping that we would see some wildflowers blooming when we were out there. And we hit the jackpot. This is what California poppies look like. This is a photo that Tim took. They really are that bright orange, and the sky really was that color of blue while we were there. This is what they look like close up off of Interstate 15, which runs north and south along the valley, and the hills where these poppies grow. This is what it looked like. Like somebody had poured orange paint over the hills. I do not think God could have chosen a better color than orange to show up on green hills. It was spectacular. And some of you may have seen on the national news, there were so many people going out to see these flowers that they had to close down the exit off of Interstate 15 for temporarily during the weekend. And local folks were calling this the poppy apocalypse because of the impact on local businesses and on the traffic around town. We were fortunate enough to find a field a little ways away from the major thoroughfare where my mom and my older brother and Tim and I met my uncle and a couple cousins, and we took some wonderful poppy pictures. Thank you very much. It's worth noting that these poppies, while they are spectacular, are a flash in the pan. They're wildflowers that grow on rocky hillsides. They're self-reseeding annuals, which means they drop their seeds when they're done blooming. And if there's enough water, which might not be for years, they'll bloom again. But they don't have deep roots. They're not very long lasting, especially when 150,000 people trample through them. But when I was in California, I was thinking about trees. And there is nothing in nature which blooms continually. Trees have to find a way to stay alive in every season, in drought, in storm, in winds, whatever the conditions are. In chapter 10 of Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, the letter which we know as 1 Corinthians, Paul is exploring the relationship of history and faith, of testing and endurance and grace. He begins by talking about Moses and the Israelites in the wilderness. The Israelites were lost, and God guided them with a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. They were hungry, and God fed them with manna from heaven. They were thirsty, and Moses struck a rock, and sweet water gushed out for them to drink. Paul says that rock was Christ. Those Israelites were nourished by the grace of God. And yet, we read time and time again in the Exodus account how the people of Israel whined and grumbled. Murmuring is my favorite Old Testament word for this kind of complaining. You can say it to yourself. Murmur, 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 murmur. We know, although Paul doesn't mention it here, that the Israelites went even further than murmuring, and they actually donated all of their gold jewelry and gave it to Moses' brother Aaron so that he could make a golden calf for them to worship, because they just couldn't wait around for Moses to come down from Mount Sinai, where Moses had been talking to Yahweh. The people were given grace, and they chose evil instead. Now, some of the people at the church in Corinth were making similarly bad choices. There was a man there who was having sexual relations with his mother-in-law. This is never a good idea. Paul is cautioning the Corinthians not to test God's grace. It's okay if you laugh. I'll give you a little time here. Paul is cautioning the Corinthians not to test God's grace by claiming that because they have received Christ's grace, they can do whatever they want. Accepting Christ's grace does not give us the license to do whatever we want. In verse 12, Paul writes, "If you think you are standing, be careful that you do not fall." In other words, when we are most confident in our own strength, when we are most sure of our own self-righteousness, is the time that we are most vulnerable to sin and to cheapening the grace of Christ. Grace is free, but it comes at the cost of us actually changing the behaviors that dishonor God or dishonor ourselves or others. I want to linger a bit on 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, because I think it's important, both for how it is used and how I think it has been misused. That verse says, "God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength." Now, I have had people who are grieving or at a loss or at a terrible time in their lives quote that verse to me. And it usually goes something like this: "I know that God won't give me more than I can handle, but God has a lot more confidence in how strong I am than I do." In other words, I don't know how I'm going to make it through this. I hope that God knows the way. That is a dark and a desperate place to be. At the end of our rope, where we're not sure that we have the strength or maybe even the will to go on. But that place is exactly where grace finds us. Hanging on is the opposite of the self-sufficiency and self-righteousness, which has it all figured out and is just waiting for everyone else to see it the right way, which just happens to be my way. I don't mean to minimize how terrible it is to feel like we are being tested beyond our strength and that we don't know how we're going to face another day. I have been in that place. I know some of you have been there too. Perhaps you're there now. We cannot appreciate the grace of those experiences until we're through them. Verse 13 ends with the testing, God will provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. Just a note here. Although I believe the promise and the truth of this verse, it is not one to throw around lightly. If you know someone is experiencing terrible pain or loss, it's probably not the most helpful thing to say, well, God won't give you anything you can't handle. Especially if you say that and walk away. If you use that verse to avoid being actually emotionally present with that person. Finding the grace to get through difficult life situations, whether they are unavoidable disasters or self-inflicted disasters or some combination of those two things. Getting through that loss and pain is some of the most difficult things that any of us will ever do. We need God's assurances and faithfulness to withstand them. Don't cheapen that struggle by saying it'll all work out and then walking away. Paul mentions specifically that we need God in order to withstand the storms of life. But he doesn't mention something else here, which I believe is important, and that is other people. Of course, other people can be the cause of our problems, but a healthy community of support and prayer and encouragement is invaluable. Another thing people say to me is, I don't know how somebody without a church family gets through an experience like this. I don't know either. What I do know is that friends and prayers have held me at the places when I have most needed it. And they have helped me to heal and given me the strength to go on. It is even better when you have nurtured and developed those relationships before the crisis hits. That's why I want to end with some reflections about trees. Trees of the same species are often connected through their root systems, which share water and other nutrients. Strong roots allow trunks to be sturdy enough to support the enormous weight of branches. Think how much more difficult it is to support weight far away from your body than it is to pick up something heavy close to your trunk. Anything which is rooted outdoors is going to face adverse conditions, maybe drought or a catastrophic storm. Trees, like poppies or any other plant, need water from rain, but they can be damaged, snapped off, or uprooted by high winds. A tree which has other trees growing nearby is much less susceptible to this kind of damage. I think I understand the physics of this, but the only way I can demonstrate it is to use my hands, so pardon me here. The things that's most potentially damaging to a tree is a sustained high wind, because it puts pressure all on the same part of the tree. The tree doesn't have an opportunity to recover. Another tree, even if it is not directly in the path of the wind, helps this for the tree. Because trees all have different branches and leaves which deflect the wind at different rates. So a couple trees together will break up that wind from being one steady stream into little eddies and different winds of the tree. That's why if you look outside during a storm, you see trees. You can do this yourself if you want. You can see trees like moving in all different directions. They're not all swaying the same way. If you read Psalm 29, it is an account of a thunderstorm sweeping across the hills of Lebanon. And it has a memorable verse in it. It says, "The voice of God causes the oaks to whirl." So whirling trees is a pretty good image of what it is like to be a tree in a thunderstorm. It's not a bad image for us when we are caught in the midst of an emotional and spiritual storm. Supportive people are not a substitute for God's grace, but they can help us weather a storm rather than being destroyed by it. As we grow in grace, we develop roots and grow sturdy systems of support not only for ourselves, but for the community which we are part of. For those of you who have shared this morning about storms that are blowing for you or your family, God bless you. If you are carrying a concern but have not shared it aloud, God bless you. If you have offered a prayer or a kind word or a warm smile to someone who is struggling, God bless you. It may be your kindness which gives someone else the strength they need for the moment or for the day. In sunlight or in cyclone, may we all grow in the knowledge of Jesus Christ, who gives us the grace to withstand the storm. Amen.